The Empire gave me 30 minutes to clear out my office. I used 28 of them to finish my coffee, and 2 to grab the one thing they'd actually miss. The data chip was smaller than my thumbnail. It held 900 years of treaty mathematics, every renegotiated variable, every species-specific temporal clause, every gravitational buffer adjustment since the Accord of Tessavar Prime. The Empire's new Supreme Commander didn't know it existed. That's because he'd spent his career in fleet operations, where the physics that matters is kinetic, and the only math you need is targeting solutions. I slipped it into my jacket pocket and walked out past the honor guard. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I didn't give the very handsome junior officer who was escorting me out the satisfaction of seeing General Nadia Ilyukhina of the 1st Peacekeeping Directorate behave like she'd been ambushed. I had been ambushed, but that's what the coffee was for. The Varathi ambassador delegation was in the atrium, 7 of them, tall and pale blue, their secondary eyelids cycling the way they do when they're processing something unsettling. Ambassador Tessavar stood at the front. I'd worked with Tessavar for 11 years. I could read that face the way I read a pressure gauge, and right now it was reading. Something has gone very wrong with the humans. General Ilyukhina, Tessavar said. The Varathi don't do titles ironically, but I'd spent enough time with them to hear the weight behind it. The title I still had for approximately 40 more meters of corridor. Ambassador. I stopped walking. The junior officer looked like he wanted to say something about time constraints, and I held up one finger without looking at him. He reconsidered. You're here for the renewal review. We are. Tessavar's secondary eyelids cycled again. We understood you would be presiding. Change of plans. Fleet Admiral Drevnik will be handling it. I smiled the smile I use when I need to project absolute confidence while internally doing math that I don't like the answers to. He's very capable. This was technically true in the same way that a wrench is technically capable of performing neurosurgery. Tessavar looked at me for a long moment. The Varathi process information through something that doesn't map neatly onto human facial expressions, but I had learned to read the micro-tightening around the secondary eye clusters that meant. I have a great deal more to say, and I am choosing not to say it in this context. I see, Tessavar said. I handed the junior officer my badge, my sidearm, and my directorate credentials in that order. Then I looked back at Tessavar and said, "You might want to call me in about 4 hours." I walked out into the city and found a transit lounge with decent coffee and borrowed computing access, and I started doing math. The renewal equation for the Tessavar Accord has 47 variables. I know this because I wrote 31 of them and inherited the other 16 from my predecessor, Admiral Bashir, who inherited his from Director Leckie, who had them from the original negotiating team 9 centuries ago. The variables cover resource extraction corridors in 6 contested systems, gravitational buffer zones around 7 inhabited moons, species-specific temporal perception clauses that account for the fact that the Varathi experience subjective time at approximately 1.4 times the rate of baseline humans, energy transfer rights, communication relay exclusion zones, and one very specific clause about a small asteroid called Tessavar 7 that both species consider sacred for completely different reasons, and which took 60 years of negotiation to resolve. Fleet Admiral Drevnik knew 6 of these variables. I know this because he called me 43 minutes after I left. I let it ring. I was working through variable 32. A paired constraint on the gravitational buffer around Tessavar 4 that had to be solved simultaneously with the energy transfer coefficient in Sector 9, because the 2 systems were coupled through a resonance effect that nobody had noticed until I'd run the full simulation in year 3 of my tenure, when someone sat down across from me. Tessavar, alone, which was unusual. The Varathi don't go anywhere without their delegation. You followed me, I said. I observed your direction of travel and calculated the most probable destination, Tessavar said. It is not the same thing. Right. I turned my screen slightly so Tessavar could see the equations. How much of this do you follow? Tessavar leaned forward and studied it with the focused stillness that Varathi use instead of squinting. The paired constraint on buffer zone 4. You are solving the coupling. I'm solving the coupling, I agreed. Your delegation's mathematical team has been assuming they're independent. They're not. If you renew with the decoupled values, the buffer drifts by about 800 meters per standard year. Over 11 years that becomes 9 kilometers. Tessavar's secondary eyelids went flat, which I had learned meant something between alarm and respect. The extraction corridor intersects. At year 11, the extraction corridor intersects the buffer at perihelion. I tapped the screen. Resource ships in contested airspace. Contested airspace triggers the Clause 4 response. Clause 4 escalates to arbitration, Tessavar said, which the Varathi conclave has not lost in 300 years. Right, but arbitration takes 80 years, during which resource flow from Sector 9 is suspended, during which approximately 400 million humans and 600 million Varathi lose access to the energy transfer they currently depend on. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway because I was having a very efficient day, and efficiency includes not wasting caffeine. 900 years, and this error has been compounding in the equation the whole time. The original negotiators decoupled the variables because they didn't have the computing power to solve the joint system. Every renewal since has inherited their mistake. Tessavar was quiet for a moment. You identified this error while being escorted from your office. I identified it 6 months ago, I said. I was going to present the corrected equation at the renewal review. Different plan now. I looked up. How many ambassadors are in there with Drevnik right now? 14 delegations, 11 species. Tessavar paused. He has presented the standard renewal framework. With the decoupled values. Yes. I finished the calculation on variable 32, linked it to 9, watched the joint solution converge to a stable equilibrium, and felt the particular satisfaction of math that works, which is one of the better feelings available to human beings, and I will defend that position. How much authority do you have? I asked. As senior ambassador, I can call for a procedural recess of up to 6 standard hours. Call for it, I said. I'll be done in 3. Tessavar looked at me with that expression I'd spent 11 years learning to read. You have no rank, Tessavar said. No official standing, no credentials. No, I agreed, but I have the math, and I have this. I set the data chip on the table between us. 900 years of treaty mathematics, every correction and amendment and renegotiated variable since Tessavar Prime. The question is whether the Empire wants the right answer or their answer. Tessavar picked up the data chip and examined it with the careful precision of someone handling something very old and very important. And if they insist on their answer, then they get a resource corridor collision in 11 years, an 80-year arbitration, and several billion people very cold and very angry. I pulled up variable 33. But I'm going to give them the option of not being catastrophically wrong, because that's the kind of person I am. I worked for 3 hours. Tessavar brought me better coffee, which I hadn't asked for, and which suggested the Varathi had a better read on human fuel requirements than I'd previously credited. I walked through every variable out loud as I solved it, explaining the logic to Tessavar the way you'd explain something to a colleague. Because Tessavar was a colleague, as far as I was concerned, regardless of what the Empire thought about it. The Varathi have a different approach to problem solving. They optimize from the top down, establishing the ideal solution first and working backward to see if it's achievable. I work from the bottom up, find out what's actually possible, and then figure out if it adds up to something acceptable. Neither approach is wrong. Together, we caught two additional small errors in variables 19 and 41 that I might have missed working alone. That's the thing about math. It doesn't care who's doing it. At hour 3, I had a complete corrected renewal equation. 47 variables, properly coupled, with full derivations and simulation results showing stable equilibrium through the next renewal period. Right, I said, let's go ruin someone's afternoon. The treaty chamber had 22-meter ceilings and walls lined with the flags of every signatory species, and it smelled like the recycled air of a room that had been sealed for important events since before I was born. I walked in with Tessavar behind me, and 11 other ambassadors behind Tessavar, because Tessavar had used the recess productively, and the room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something has gone off script. Fleet Admiral Drevnik was at the head of the table. He was a large man who had commanded 3 fleet engagements and been decorated for all of them, and he looked at me with the expression of someone who has encountered a problem that isn't on his briefing document. "General Ilyukina," he said, "you've been relieved." "Yes," I agreed. "That's correct." I set my completed calculation on the table in front of him. 14 civilizations, 47 variables, full derivations, 11-year collapse timeline, and the corrected joint solution. I thought you might want to look at this before you sign anything. He looked at it, then he looked at me. "What is this?" "It's the renewal equation," I said. "The correct one. The one you're about to sign is missing a coupling constraint between variables 4 and 9 that creates a resource corridor intersection at year 11. I pointed to the relevant section. "Here are the derivations. Here is the simulation. Here is what happens if you sign the decoupled version." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "These calculations haven't been verified by anyone with official standing," I said. "Correct. I'm a private citizen with no credentials and no rank." I slid a stylus across the table. "If you can find an error in the derivations, please circle it. I'll wait." The room was extremely quiet. Drevnik looked at the equations for a long time. He had a tactical mind. I knew that from his record, and tactical minds understand when they're looking at terrain they don't know. He picked up the stylus. He put it down. He looked at Tessavar. "The Varathi conclave has independently reviewed these calculations," Tessavar said. "We concur with the analysis." Drevnik looked at me. "You're doing this without any authority whatsoever." "Thermodynamics," I said. "It doesn't check credentials." That got a sound from the Varathi side of the table that I was fairly certain was laughter, though the Varathi don't produce it in quite the same register as humans do. What happened next took 4 hours and involved a great deal of recalculation and some very heated subvocal communication between Drevnik and someone at Imperial Command, who I was not supposed to be able to hear, but could, because the acoustics in the treaty chamber have always been terrible and nobody has ever bothered to fix it. I sat at the far end of the table and drank the coffee that Tessavar's aide produced and answered technical questions when the ambassadors had them and did not gloat, because gloating is not useful data. The Tessavar Accord was renewed, with the corrected equations, all 47 variables properly coupled, with the joint solution for the Sector 4 and 9 constraint, and 2 additional small corrections in variables 19 and 41. Signed by 14 delegations representing 11 species, counterstamped by Fleet Admiral Drevnik under what I suspected was fairly explicit instructions from people who had calculated the political cost of not doing so. The treaty holds for 900 years. The math says so. The math doesn't lie. Drevnik stopped me on the way out. "The Empire would like to discuss reinstating your commission," he said, in the tone of a man delivering a message that he did not write. "Tell them I'll think about it," I said. "Over coffee, good coffee this time." I walked out into the city. The sun was doing what suns do, which is exist at a consistent luminosity regardless of human political situations, and the air had the particular quality of afternoon on a world that mostly goes about its business without caring about treaty chambers or dismissal ceremonies. Tessavar was waiting outside. "The conclave wishes me to convey their assessment," Tessavar said. "Which is?" "That the human was removed from power." Tessavar's secondary eyelids moved in a way I had never seen before, something new, some expression I hadn't catalogued yet in 11 years of working together, and immediately began solving the problem that power had failed to see. "That's a very diplomatic way to put it," I said. "We have revised our threat assessment for your species." Tessavar said, "Upward, not because of your weapons." "Because of what we do when you take the weapons away," I said. Tessavar looked at me with those pale blue features that I had learned over 11 years to read almost as well as a human face. "Because of what you do when you take the weapons away," Tessavar agreed. I finished my coffee. The math was clean, the treaty was signed, and I was going to need approximately 40 hours of sleep and a shower that lasted longer than thermodynamics could strictly justify. But the equation was solved. The data said so, and the data doesn't care who you used to be.